Every case of unresolved tragedy eventually turns into a study of time, what it reveals, what it conceals, and how it quietly rewrites the boundaries of truth. In the Ramsey investigation, time ceased to be neutral, it became currency. Each passing day accumulated value for one side and cost for the other. What might have begun as a pause for grief evolved into a masterclass in narrative control, where silence itself functioned as testimony and delay became the most effective form of speech. The architecture of denial is not built in words, it's built in waiting. By this stage of the analysis, we've already seen how faith became fortress and performance became protection. Here, those same defensive instincts take structural form, moving beyond emotion or belief into deliberate management of chronology, access, and law. The currency of time exposes how control of timing, and therefore control of sequence, dictates control of meaning. Whether consciously strategic or reflexively defensive, the Ramsey's temporal management transformed the investigation from an evidentiary pursuit into a procedural stalemate. Time, once the investigator's ally, became the suspect's most reliable accomplice. Part 3 explores how this transformation occurred and what it reveals about justice itself. It examines the philosophical tension between truth and delay, the psychological duality of trauma recovery versus denial formation, the forensic cost of lost immediacy, and the anthropological reality of privilege shaping access to time as a defensive tool. This isn't merely about 4 months of silence, it's about how the manipulation of time can erode the very possibility of resolution. Here, the story of JonBenet Ramsey becomes a case study in temporal power, how waiting, reframing, and withholding can construct a fortress more impenetrable than any legal defense. Theme 1: The Currency of Time, When Delay Becomes Strategy. There is something profoundly revealing about the passage of time in this case, and I think we need to examine what those 4 months between JonBenet's loss and the first formal police interviews actually represented. From a logical standpoint, the timeline itself presents a compelling narrative structure. In the immediate aftermath, we see the CNN interview, raw, emotional, arguably premature from a legal strategy perspective. Then, silence. Then, 4 months later, carefully controlled interviews with conditions, attorneys present, parameters established. Logically, this progression suggests a learning curve, a realization that spontaneous media engagement created vulnerabilities that needed to be corrected through calculated control. The logic of delay isn't inherently incriminating, but it does reveal an awareness that time could be used as a tool, time to observe what investigators knew, time to understand what questions would be asked, time to ensure every answer aligned with a carefully constructed framework. The logical function of delay is preparation, and preparation can serve either innocence seeking to avoid being railroaded or guilt seeking to avoid being exposed. Philosophically, this temporal dimension raises profound questions about the relationship between truth and time. Does truth require immediacy, or can delayed truth still be authentic truth? Western philosophy has long grappled with whether spontaneity equals honesty, the assumption that immediate responses are more truthful because they haven't been filtered through conscious consideration. But this assumes that filtering equals falsification, when it might simply equal clarification. The Ramseys would argue, I think, that those 4 months weren't about constructing lies, but about ensuring they could communicate truth effectively without being manipulated or misunderstood. Philosophically, this raises questions about whether we have a right to demand immediate access to people in trauma, or whether compassion requires allowing time for psychological stabilization before extracting testimony. The tension here is between the epistemological value of spontaneity, fresh memories, unpolished responses, and the ethical consideration of trauma. People in crisis cannot reliably narrate their experience. Philosophy doesn't resolve this tension. It illuminates how both positions contain legitimate truth claims that cannot be simultaneously honored. The psychological function of this 4 month interval is perhaps the most fascinating dimension to examine. Psychologically, Time serves multiple adaptive functions for people in crisis. It allows the initial shock to metabolize into something cognitively manageable. It permits the construction of coherent narrative from fragmentary traumatic experience. It enables the development of emotional regulation strategies that prevent complete breakdown during questioning. These are normal, healthy psychological processes that innocent, traumatized people absolutely require. However, time also serves psychological functions for people managing guilt and fear of exposure. It allows the solidification of a defensive narrative that becomes psychologically true through repetition and reinforcement. It permits the cognitive integration of denial mechanisms so complete that the person can pass polygraphs and maintain consistent stories because they've genuinely convinced themselves at a deep psychological level. It enables what psychologists call motivated reasoning, the unconscious process of constructing justifications and explanations that protect the ego from unbearable truth. The psychological challenge is that these processes, healthy trauma recovery and pathological denial, can be phenomenologically identical to the person experiencing them and behaviorally identical to observers watching them. Physiologically, we must consider what 4 months of sustained stress does to memory consolidation and narrative construction. The neuroscience of trauma shows that memories formed under extreme stress are fragmented, somatically encoded, and resist normal verbal processing. It can take weeks or months for traumatic memories to consolidate into narratives that can be linguistically expressed. During this consolidation process, the brain is actively reconstructing what happened, filling gaps, creating coherence where none existed in the moment of trauma. This is unavoidable neurobiology, not conscious manipulation. However, this same neurobiological process can be exploited, consciously or unconsciously, to reshape inconvenient memories, to smooth over contradictions, to create a version of events that feels true because it's been repeatedly rehearsed until the neural pathways associated with that version are stronger than the original fragmentary encoding. The physiological reality is that by the time the Ramseys sat for formal interviews, their memories were necessarily different than they would have been in the immediate aftermath. Whether those changes reflected natural consolidation or strategic revision cannot be determined from the outside. From a forensic criminology perspective, the 4 month delay represents a catastrophic loss of investigative opportunity that fundamentally compromised the case, regardless of who bears responsibility for that delay. Forensically, the golden hours after an incident are when memories are freshest, when spontaneous statements can be captured, when behavioral observations are most revealing, when crime scenes are most intact. Every hour that passes degrades the evidentiary value of witness testimony and physical evidence. 4 months represents not just a delay, but an investigative disaster. The question forensically is whether this disaster resulted from the Ramseys exercising legitimate rights in the face of investigative hostility, or whether it resulted from a calculated strategy to ensure that by the time formal questioning occurred, the trail would be cold, memories would be consolidated, and every response would be legally vetted. Forensic analysis suggests both possibilities contain truth. The Ramseys had legitimate reasons to fear investigative bias and legitimate reasons to seek legal protection. But the forensic effect of their choices was to create exactly the conditions that someone wishing to avoid accountability would need to create. Anthropologically, the Ramseys' ability to successfully delay formal cooperation for 4 months reveals profound truths about how social class mediates interactions with justice systems. Lower socioeconomic suspects cannot typically afford the legal firepower necessary to control investigative timelines. They cannot hire media consultants to manage public narrative. They cannot retreat to secure locations while their attorneys negotiate terms. The Ramseys possess what anthropologists call structural power, the capacity to shape the conditions of institutional interaction based on access to resources. This anthropological reality means that justice operates on different timelines for differently positioned people. The Ramseys' 4-month delay wasn't available to most suspects, it was a privilege of their social position. Understanding this anthropological dimension doesn't tell us whether they were guilty or innocent, but it does reveal that the investigation unfolded according to rules that their class position allowed them to write. This is how structural inequality operates, not through explicit conspiracy, but through differential access to the tools that shape outcomes. Through the criminal mindset lens, we must examine what temporal control accomplishes for someone potentially responsible for harm. A perpetrator facing investigation needs several things that time provides: observation of what investigators know and don't know, opportunity to identify and address vulnerabilities in their account, space to cultivate allies and marginalize skeptics, distance from the emotional immediacy that might lead to confession. The 4-month delay provided all of these strategic advantages. It allowed the Ramseys to see what evidence the police had collected, what theories they were pursuing, what holes existed in the investigation. It permitted the construction of responses that addressed every known challenge without revealing information investigators hadn't yet discovered. It created temporal distance from the event itself, making spontaneous emotional responses less expected and calculated responses more acceptable. Criminal psychology recognizes this as strategic temporal positioning, controlling when cooperation occurs to maximize defensive advantage. However, trauma psychology recognizes that innocent people who feel attacked also seek to control timing to ensure they're psychologically capable of coherent testimony. The behavioral pattern serves both possibilities. What troubles me most about this temporal dimension is how it reveals the potential weaponization of legal rights in ways that serve justice or subvert it, depending on underlying truth. The Ramseys had every legal right to delay cooperation, to demand attorney presence, to control the conditions of their testimony. These rights exist precisely to protect innocent people from coercive or abusive investigation. Yet these same rights, when exercised to their maximum extent, can create insurmountable barriers to truth discovery. The 4 months weren't illegal, weren't unethical from a defense perspective, but they may have been incompatible with solving the case. This creates a profound moral paradox that doing what you have every right to do can still contribute to injustice if those rights are used not to protect truth, but to forestall it. I cannot determine which function the delay served in this case, but I can observe that the effect was identical regardless of intention, a case frozen in perpetual ambiguity, questions that could have been answered in hour 1 left unanswerable by month 4, and a little girl's truth buried beneath layers of legal strategy and temporal distance that may never be excavated. Theme 2: The performance of suffering. When grief becomes theater. Let's examine something deeply uncomfortable but necessary: the relationship between genuine grief and its public performance, and what happens when the two become difficult to distinguish. From a logical standpoint, we face a fundamental problem in evaluating the Ramseys' public expressions of loss. Grief is not a standardized emotion with predictable manifestations. People grieve differently based on personality, culture, upbringing, and circumstance. Yet we persistently judge grief as if it should follow recognizable patterns: tears, visible anguish, vocal distress. When someone's grief doesn't match our expectations, we become suspicious. The logical problem is that this suspicion often says more about our assumptions than about the griever's authenticity. However, logic also demands we examine the context in which grief is displayed. The Ramseys' grief appeared most visibly in controlled media settings: the CNN interview, later public statements, carefully staged appearances. Meanwhile, in investigative contexts where cooperation would advance justice for JonBenet, their presentation was often more guarded, more legalistic, less emotionally accessible. This logical pattern, grief as public performance, restraint as private practice, invites scrutiny not because grief itself is suspicious, but because the selective deployment of grief suggests possible instrumentalization. Philosophically, we're confronting the ancient distinction between being and seeming, the Socratic question of whether appearance reflects reality or obscures it. The Ramseys appeared grief-stricken in public forums while appearing defended and calculating in investigative contexts. Philosophy asks whether this reflects the natural compartmentalization of human emotion. We show different faces in different settings, or the strategic deployment of emotion for rhetorical effect. We perform the feelings that serve our objectives in each context. Existential philosophy recognizes that in modernity, we're always performing ourselves to some degree. There's no authentic self separate from its social presentations. From this view, the Ramseys' grief performance isn't necessarily inauthentic. It's simply the version of grief they chose to make public. However, phenomenological philosophy insists that genuine emotion has a quality of immediacy and involuntariness that distinguishes it from calculated performance. The question becomes whether the Ramseys' public grief possessed that phenomenological authenticity or whether it felt rehearsed, managed, deployed, rather than experienced and expressed. Philosophy cannot answer this empirically, but it can frame the question in ways that sharpen our analysis. The psychological dynamics of performed emotion are extraordinarily complex and often misunderstood by observers seeking simple answers. Psychologically, people in genuine grief often perform their grief because they need external validation of their internal experience. They need others to see their pain, to witness their loss, to confirm that their suffering is real and justified. This isn't manipulation, it's a fundamental human need for emotional recognition. The Ramseys' decision to go on CNN shortly after JonBenet's loss could reflect exactly this need, a desperate attempt to make the world see their anguish, to confirm their victimhood, to externalize the unbearable internal experience. However, psychology also recognizes that performed emotion can serve defensive functions by controlling the narrative of grief. When it's displayed, how it's framed, what conclusions observers should draw from it, people can preempt more uncomfortable questions. The psychological function of public grief performance can be to create such a powerful emotional impression that skepticism feels cruel. This is what psychologists call affect management, using emotional display to control others' responses. Both genuine need for recognition and strategic affect management can motivate identical behaviors, making psychological analysis frustratingly ambiguous. Physiologically, the human stress response in public versus private context differs in ways that complicate our interpretation of the Ramseys' differential presentation. When performing grief publicly, on camera, before audiences, the body's sympathetic nervous system activates in ways that can intensify emotional display. Adrenaline increases, voice may quaver, tears may flow more readily, all physiological responses to the stress of public exposure that can amplify genuine grief or create the appearance of grief independent of underlying emotion. Conversely, in adversarial investigative contexts, the body's threat response may activate defensive physiology that suppresses emotional expression, increased cortisol, muscular tension, flattened affect. These are survival responses that make emotional accessibility difficult even when emotion exists internally. Understanding this physiological dimension suggests the Ramseys could have been genuinely grief-stricken, but physiologically incapable of expressing it appropriately in investigative contexts they experienced as threatening. However, the same physiological knowledge could theoretically be exploited, understanding that public contexts amplify emotional display while private contexts suppress it, choosing to grieve publicly and remain guarded privately to create maximum protective effect. And that's where the performance ends, or perhaps where it begins. Between what we feel and what we show lies the thinnest of boundaries. And in the Ramsey case, that boundary never held. Their grief exists in two worlds, one public and amplified, one private and guarded. Whether that split was born of trauma or intent, the effect is the same. Emotion became theater, and theater became protection. Next, we step into the realm where those performances meet evidence, where investigators must separate expression from information, and where the human heart collides with forensic method.